Don't get on that plane. That's what the little girl said, voice barely above a whisper, hand gripping the cuff of his overcoat like he was the one who needed saving. Raymond Garrett almost laughed. He'd flown 243 times in the last decade, had a board meeting in Zurich, a wife waiting back home in Greenwich, a pilot he'd trusted for 9 years. But there was something in her eyes, something old, something that didn't belong on a face that young, something that made the laughter die somewhere between his chest and his throat. Why, he asked. She looked at the tarmac, then at him, then at the cockpit window where the pilot was running through his checklist. Because the man in there, she said, isn't the same man who flew you last week. Raymond would later say those words saved his life. He'd also say something stranger, something he never thought he'd admit out loud, that the most dangerous moment of his 61 years wasn't on that tarmac. It was what he'd been refusing to see for 7 years before it. But we'll come back to that. The girl's name was Willa. Raymond didn't know that yet. He only knew she was maybe 9, maybe 10. Navy uniform, 2 sizes too big. The look of a child who'd grown up around adults who didn't bother lowering their voices. She was the daughter of the woman who cleaned the private terminal at Westchester County Airport. Raymond had walked past her mother 1,000 times, said good morning maybe twice. The kind of woman you stop seeing after the first month because she becomes part of the wallpaper. Like the leather chairs in the coffee station and the polished brass nobody touches. The kind of invisibility that turns out to be the most useful thing in the world, if you happen to be listening. Raymond looked down at Willa and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear exactly, something quieter. The sense that the floor he'd been standing on his whole life was thinner than he thought. Sweetheart, he said, kneeling down, because some part of him still wanted to handle this the way a powerful man handles small inconveniences. What's your name, Willa? Willa, where's your mom? She's mopping the bathroom in Terminal B. She told me to wait by the window. She doesn't know I came out here. He glanced at his watch. A Patek Philippe his wife had given him on their 20th anniversary. The hand said 7:51. He was supposed to be wheels up at 8:05. Willa, listen to me. That pilot, his name is Captain Thomas Hale. He's flown me to Zurich twice a year for 9 years. I know his wife. I know his kids' names. He flew me last Tuesday to Chicago. No, she said. Raymond went still. He didn't fly you Tuesday. Tuesday it was a different man. Same uniform, same hat, same walk on the way to the plane. But it wasn't him. She paused. And what she said next would stay with Raymond longer than any deal he'd ever closed, any contract he'd ever signed, any handshake that had moved millions from one side of a table to the other. I know because Captain Hale always stops at the window and waves at my mom. He's been doing it for 2 years. He says it costs nothing to make someone feel seen. She looked down at her shoes. They were scuffed. One lace was untied. Tuesday, the man didn't wave. Tuesday, the man didn't even look. Now, there's a detail in this story that most people miss when they hear it for the first time. It's not about the pilot. It's not about the plane. It's about a sentence a 9-year-old girl said on a cold tarmac in November that contained more wisdom than most boardrooms produce in a decade. It costs nothing to make someone feel seen. Captain Thomas Hale had said that to a cleaning woman through a cockpit window. He'd said it with a wave, a small gesture, 2 seconds of his morning, and that wave had become a tripwire. A silent alarm built not by engineers or security consultants, but by a man who understood that kindness is its own kind of surveillance. When the wave stopped, the wrong man was in the cockpit. A 9-year-old girl noticed. A 61-year-old billionaire did not. Raymond could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, which struck him as ridiculous. He'd closed deals worth 9 figures without his pulse moving. He'd sat across from men who ran countries and never blinked. But standing on that tarmac, looking down at a child in a uniform too big for her, his heart was pounding like he was 22 again, and the world hadn't decided yet what kind of man he was going to be. And last night, Willa said, I heard your wife on the phone in the lounge. She didn't see me. I was under the table picking up my pencil. Raymond's mouth went dry. She was crying. But not the kind of crying you do when you're sad. The other kind. What other kind? Willa looked at him with that ancient look again. The kind you do when you've already made up your mind. Raymond Garrett had built his fortune reading rooms. Reading faces across boardroom tables. Reading the small tremor in a man's hand when he was bluffing. the way a woman's eyes shifted when she was about to lowball a counteroffer. He'd grown up in East Baltimore, son of a welder and a school lunch lady, and he'd learned to read people the way other kids learn to read books. Because when you grow up where he grew up, reading people isn't a skill, it's survival. He'd been called a lot of things in his life. Ruthless, brilliant, cold, self-made. The kind of words they put on magazine covers when a black man builds something they didn't expect him to build. But nobody had ever called him blind. And yet, standing on that tarmac looking down at a 9-year-old girl whose mother mopped floors for a living, he understood something that should have terrified him. He had been blind for years, maybe decades, because the people you trust most are the people you stop watching. Willa, he said quietly, what else did you hear? She bit her lip. She was doing the math any kid in her position would do. What happens to her mother if she's wrong? What happens to her mother if she's right and she stays quiet? What happens to the woman who scrubs coffee stains off tile floors if her daughter accuses a billionaire's wife of something that can't be taken back? She said a name twice. Leon. Raymond felt the ground shift, not physically, something deeper, like the foundation of a house cracking in a place you can't see. Leon, his brother-in-law, the one he'd pulled out of bankruptcy in 2016, the one whose daughter's college he was paying for, the one whose name was on 3 of his charitable foundations as a board member because his wife Vivian had begged him to give Leon something to feel proud of. She said Willa continued her voice steady in a way that no 9-year-old's voice should be steady. She said, Marcus, are you sure he won't suffer? And then she said, Marcus, I just want it to be quick. Raymond felt his knees go soft for the first time since his father's funeral in 1991. That funeral in Baltimore. The church on North Avenue where his father's friends, men with hands like leather, had carried the casket, and not one of them had cried because that's not what men from that neighborhood did. They carried the weight, and they kept walking. Raymond had learned to carry weight that day. He'd carried it for 30 years. He'd carried it across boardrooms and balance sheets and time zones. He'd carried it so well that he'd forgotten what it felt like to put anything down. But standing on that tarmac, hearing Leon's name come out of a child's mouth, he felt every pound of it at once. She said Marcus, not Leon. Willa had heard the name wrong. Or Vivian had used a different name on the phone. It didn't matter. Raymond knew. In his bones, in the place where a man keeps the truths he's been refusing to look at, he knew exactly who Vivian had been talking to. Leon. The same Leon who last month at Easter dinner had asked very specific questions about Raymond's flight schedule. When are you heading to Zurich next? Which airport? Still flying with Hale. You ever worry about those small planes over the Atlantic? Raymond had answered every question. He'd even laughed. He'd said something about how he trusted Hale more than he trusted most of his board members. Everyone at the table had laughed. Vivian had smiled. Leon had smiled. And somewhere in that room, behind the ham and the good china and the wine that cost more than Lorraine Beckett made in a month, a plan had been confirmed. Raymond stood up slowly. His knees clicked. The sound of a 61-year-old body doing what 61-year-old bodies do. His hand found the railing of the boarding stairs. He looked up at the cockpit window. The pilot was looking down at him. And for the first time in 9 years of flying that route, the man behind the glass didn't smile. There are 2 kinds of silence in a man's life. That's what Raymond had always believed. The silence before a decision and the silence after. Standing on that tarmac with the cold November wind cutting through his coat and a 9-year-old girl's hand still gripping his cuff, he realized there was a third kind. The silence of a man who finally hears what's been screaming at him for years and has nowhere to put the sound. He didn't board the plane. He told the ground crew his stomach was bothering him, said it loud enough for the cockpit to hear, said he'd reschedule for tomorrow. He even managed a small laugh, the kind men his age used to wave off concern. Bad oysters last night. Gentlemen, you know how it is. The pilot in the cockpit nodded once, slow, measured. The way a man nods when he's been told the deal is off, but hasn't decided yet whether to fight about it. Raymond walked Willa back to Terminal B himself, held her hand like she was his own granddaughter. His granddaughter Lily was 6 years old, lived in Denver, and he hadn't held her hand since August. He'd missed her brother James's 4th birthday because of a trip to Singapore. He'd sent a check, a big one. Adrian had thanked him by text. 3 words. THX, Dad Generous. Punctuation of a closing door. But that thought would have to wait. There was something else he needed to see first. Willa, he said as they walked through the corridor that smelled like industrial lemon cleaner. You said you've been watching the pilots. For how long? She didn't answer right away. She reached into the pocket of her oversized uniform and pulled out a small notebook. It had a unicorn on the cover. Purple. The horn was peeling. She handed it to him. Raymond opened it, and what he saw inside made him stop walking. Pages. Dozens of pages. Each one dated. Each one filled with careful handwriting and small drawings. Every pilot who'd flown out of that terminal for the past 6 months. Names or the names Willa had invented when she didn't know the real ones. Dates. Little notes in the corners. Smiled, waved, didn't wave. Had a different watch. Walked funny today. Brought coffee for the ground crew. Forgot his bag and came back. New shoes. A 9-year-old's intelligence operation. Run out of a custodian's break room. Fueled by chocolate milk and animal crackers and the kind of attention that wealthy men paid millions of dollars to consultants to replicate, and never quite managed. Raymond closed the notebook. He didn't give it back. This is important, he said. Do you understand? This is very important. Willa nodded. She understood more than he realized. Children who grow up invisible learn to read the weight of a moment the way other children learn to read clocks. He found Lorraine on her knees outside the women's room in Terminal B, scrubbing a coffee stain off the tile. Yellow rubber gloves. A bucket that had seen better years. The radio on her cart was playing something soft and gospel turned low enough that only she could hear it. She looked up and saw her daughter's hand inside the hand of the richest man she'd ever cleaned a toilet for. And the color drained from her face so fast, Raymond thought she was going to faint. Ma'am, Raymond said, and he could hear his own voice shaking. Which was new. He had addressed senators and didn't shake. He had spoken at his own father's funeral and didn't shake. But standing in front of a woman on her knees with a scrub brush, he shook. Your daughter just did something most adults in my life have never done. She told me the truth. Lorraine didn't understand. She started apologizing. She started promising Willa would be punished. She started saying, please, sir, over and over the way a woman says it when she spent her whole life learning that powerful men and trouble come in the same package. Raymond held up a hand, gently. Lorraine, he said, reading her name off the badge for the first time in 3 years of walking past her. 3 years. 1,000 mornings. And he'd never read her name until this moment. That fact alone told him something about the man he'd been. Something he wasn't ready to sit with yet. I need you to go home today. Both of you. Take a car. I'll have one of my people drive you. Tell no one where you went. Not your sister. Not your pastor. Not the neighbor who watches Willa after school. Nobody. She stared at him. Is my daughter in trouble? No, he said. I am. And she just got me out of it. Lorraine looked at Willa. Willa looked at the floor. The silence between a mother and daughter who have survived enough to know when questions aren't going to help. It would be 3 weeks before Lorraine fully understood what he meant. It would be 3 months before Willa stopped having dreams about cockpit windows. But that morning in a fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled like bleach and cheap coffee, Raymond Garrett pulled out his phone and made the first phone call of a different life. Not to the police, not yet. To his oldest friend, a man named Frank DeMarco, who'd done 32 years as a federal investigator before retiring to grow tomatoes in New Jersey. Frank had warned him about Vivian in 2018. Raymond had stopped returning his calls for a year after that. That year of silence was one of the most expensive things Raymond had ever purchased, and he was a man who owned 6 houses. Frank picked up on the second ring. Ray, you're supposed to be in the air. Frank, what's wrong with your voice? Frank, I need you. I need you today. I need you to come get me at Westchester. What happened? Raymond looked at Willa, who was now hiding behind her mother's leg, watching him with those eyes that didn't belong on a child. Eyes that had seen too much through too many windows. Eyes that had kept a record when nobody asked her to. Frank, he said, I think my wife tried to have me killed this morning, and I think she's been planning it since the day I made her sign the prenup. There was a long silence on the other end. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a man who already knew, who had tried to say it 4 years ago and been cut off for the trouble. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't go home. Don't call her. Don't answer if she calls. He paused. And Ray, whoever told you, protect them. They just became the most important person in your life. Raymond hung up. He looked down at Willa. She was still holding her mother's leg, still watching him. The unicorn notebook was in his coat pocket now. He could feel its weight. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. He arranged a car for Lorraine and Willa, a black sedan with a driver who asked no questions. He watched them pull away from the terminal. Willa's face appeared in the back window for a moment, small and serious, and then the car turned a corner and she was gone. Raymond stood alone in the parking lot of Terminal B. The November wind was sharper now. His phone said 8:03, 2 minutes before he was supposed to be wheels up. He could hear the engines of his plane on the other side of the terminal. Winding up, the sound he'd heard 243 times. The sound that meant business, progress. Another city, another deal. Another reason to not be in the room where his wife was pouring wine she didn't share and making phone calls she didn't mention. The sound faded as the plane taxied toward the runway. He stood there and listened to it go. Frank arrived in a pickup truck that was older than most of Raymond's suits, a Ford F-150 dark blue rust on the wheel wells. The passenger seat had a coffee ring on the dashboard that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. The radio was tuned to an AM station that played the kind of jazz that nobody under 50 listened to anymore. Frank DeMarco was 63 years old, Italian from Newark. The kind of man who ironed his undershirts and still called women ma'am and had never in his life used the word synergy. He and Raymond had shared a dorm room at Fordham in 1983. Raymond from East Baltimore. Frank from the Ironbound. Two kids who had no business being in the same room and became the kind of friends that only happens when you're 19 and the world hasn't sorted you into categories yet. Frank had warned him about Vivian in 2018. He'd sat across from Raymond at a steakhouse in Manhattan and said very carefully in the way a man speaks when he knows the next sentence could end a 40-year friendship. Ray, I've been looking into some things. Not because anyone asked me to, because I couldn't sleep. Raymond had put down his fork. He'd looked at Frank the way he looked at people who disappointed him. The look that had ended careers. The look that board members talked about in hallways. She's my wife, Frank. I know she is. Then stop. Frank had stopped, and Raymond had stopped returning his calls. For a year. A full year. 52 Sundays of silence between two men who had once stayed up until 4 in the morning in a dorm room arguing about whether Miles Davis or John Coltrane was the greater musician. Raymond had said Coltrane. Frank had said Miles. They'd never settled it. They probably never would. Ever. Now Frank was driving him away from an airport where a plane was taking off without him. A plane that was supposed to kill him. And the only words either of them could find were the small ones. You okay, no. You hurt, not the kind you can see. They drove in silence for a while. Frank's hands at 10 and 2, the way he'd been taught in 1971 and never seen a reason to update. Outside the window, Westchester County rolled past in shades of gray and brown. November in the northeast. The trees stripped. The sky the color of old concrete. Raymond's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. That's going to be her, Frank said. Checking in, making sure you're on the plane. Raymond stared straight ahead. The phone buzzed again. Let it ring, Frank said. Let her wonder. They were 14 miles south of the airport when it happened. Frank had the police scanner running low under the radio. A habit from 32 years of federal work. The kind of habit you don't break even when you're retired, and your biggest concern is whether the tomatoes need more water. The scanner crackled. A voice came through. Professional. Clipped. The tone of a man who delivers the worst news in the world the same way he orders coffee. Beechcraft King Air. Tail number November 22. Charlie Garrett, lost contact. Last known position 14 miles southeast of Montauk. Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. Just slightly. A man who had heard 1,000 terrible things come through a scanner and learned to hold the steering wheel instead of the grief. Raymond heard the words. He understood them individually. Beechcraft, King Air, his tail number, lost contact, Montauk. But the sentence they formed didn't make sense. Not yet. The way a doctor's diagnosis doesn't make sense for the first 30 seconds. The words are there. The meaning hasn't arrived. Then it arrived. The plane he was supposed to be on. The plane he had walked away from 22 minutes ago because a 9-year-old girl in a uniform too big for her had grabbed his sleeve and said, "Don't." That plane was gone. Frank pulled the truck to the shoulder of the road. He didn't say anything. He killed the engine. He sat there with his hands still on the wheel and let Raymond have the silence. Emergency vehicles began to pass. One, then two, then a convoy. Lights on. No sirens yet. The kind of organized urgency that meant they already knew there was nothing to rush toward. Raymond watched them go, red and white lights reflecting off the bare trees, one after another, heading toward a coast where pieces of his airplane were falling into cold water. He thought about Captain Thomas Hale, the real one, the man who waved at cleaning women through cockpit windows because it cost nothing to make someone feel seen. Where was Hale right now? Did he know his identity had been borrowed? Did he know that someone wearing his uniform and sitting in his seat had just gone down over the Atlantic? He thought about the man who had been in that cockpit, the one who didn't wave, the one who didn't smile, the one who'd nodded once slow and measured when Raymond said he wasn't boarding. What was that man thinking in his final minutes? Was he afraid? Was he relieved? Did he know he was going to die, or did he believe the plan would work and he'd land somewhere quiet and disappear into whatever life? $50,000 buys a man willing to crash a plane. Raymond would never know. And somehow that was the detail that made it real. Not the scanner, not the emergency lights, the not knowing. The understanding that a man had just died in a seat that was meant for him, and he would never know that man's name or his reasons or whether he had children. Frank Raymond said. His voice was steady, steadier than it should have been. The steadiness of a man who grew up in a neighborhood where you learned to keep your voice level when the world was falling apart, because falling apart was a luxury that boys from East Baltimore couldn't afford. Frank. Yeah, Ray. She actually did it. Frank nodded. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. The tiredness of a man who had been right about something terrible and would have given anything to be wrong. Yeah, she did. They sat there on the shoulder of a highway in Westchester County while emergency vehicles screamed past and a scanner reported debris, and the November sky hung low and gray over everything like a ceiling that was never going to lift. Raymond's phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, looked at the screen for the first time. 3 missed calls from Vivian, 1 text message. Baby, where are you? Your office said you left for the airport. Call me. Baby. She hadn't called him baby in 4 years. He'd noticed at the time. He'd told himself it was natural. 30-year marriages don't have babies in them anymore. Couples settle into other words. Honorable dear. Just the bare name. He'd told himself a lot of things. She was rehearsing already. 40 minutes after she thought she'd killed him, she was already practicing the voice she'd use for the cameras. Baby, where are you? The lowercase intimacy of it. The performance of concern. Some part of her had been writing this text in her head for months, maybe years. The way an actress rehearses a line until it sounds unrehearsed. He put the phone back in his pocket, face down. He didn't turn it off. He wanted it to keep buzzing. He wanted to feel it against his leg like a heartbeat from a life that was already over. Frank started the engine. He pulled back onto the highway. Where are we going? Raymond asked. Somewhere you can think. Frank drove them to a diner just over the Connecticut line. The kind of place that has a bell over the door and a waitress who calls everyone Han and coffee that tastes like it was brewed during the previous administration. The vinyl booths had duct tape on the seams. The menu was laminated and sticky. Raymond sat down across from Frank. He picked up the menu. He looked at it. He looked at the word omelet. He read it 4 times before he understood what it meant. This is what shock looks like in a man who has never been allowed to have any. It looks like a 61-year-old in a custom Brioni suit sitting in a vinyl booth with duct tape on the seam, unable to read a laminated menu. A man who had grown up in East Baltimore, who had worked his way through Fordham on a scholarship and stubbornness, who had built a company that employed 400 people and generated revenue that moved markets. A man who had been on the cover of Forbes with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the photograph they always take of black men who build empires, the pose that says, I belong here, and I dare you to say otherwise. That man was sitting in a diner in Connecticut, unable to read the word omelet. Frank ordered for both of them. Eggs, bacon, coffee, toast. Eat slow, Frank said. You're going to throw up if you eat fast. The food came. Raymond looked at the eggs. They were yellow. The bacon was the kind that curves. The toast had too much butter on it the way diner toast always does. He picked up his fork. He put it down. Frank? Yeah. Why didn't I listen to you in 2018? Frank stirred his coffee. He took his time. He was a man who'd spent his career learning that the answer you give a friend at the worst moment of his life becomes the answer he carries for the next decade. So you better get it right. Because nobody wants to hear that the person they sleep next to is auditioning for the role of Widow Ray. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of imagination. Smart men can't imagine the people they love being smaller than they are. That's the trap. That's the whole trap. Raymond put his fork down. Tell me what you knew. Frank exhaled. He looked out the window. A woman walked past holding the hand of a little girl in a puffy coat. The girl was telling her mother something with her whole body, gesturing, hopping with every other word. The mother was bent down listening, actually listening. The way mothers listen when the child is young enough that whatever she's saying is the most important news in the world. Frank turned back. I knew she met with a divorce attorney in 2017. Quietly. Never filed. I knew she walked out of that office because the attorney told her she'd walk away with maybe 12–15% of what you were worth on paper. Because of how you'd structured the trust. Because your father's friend, that lawyer in Baltimore, the one who did your first incorporation for free when you were 26, he'd built the trust like a man who grew up watching people lose everything. Airtight. Frank paused. I knew she went home that night and didn't say anything to you. That's what bothered me. Most women would have come home angry. She came home and made you a pot roast. Raymond closed his eyes. I remember that pot roast. Yeah, I bet you do. That was the night she said she wanted to renew our vows. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pot roast sat between them like evidence, which in a way it was. Raymond opened his eyes. He looked at his oldest friend across a table in a diner that smelled like grease and coffee, and the quiet desperation of people eating breakfast at a time of day when breakfast means you have nowhere else to be. I want to disappear, Raymond said. Frank's eyebrows went up, just slightly. I want her to think I'm dead. I want her to bury me. I want her to read the will. I want her to start spending the money. I want to see exactly who she becomes when she thinks she's won. Frank looked at him for a long time. Ray, that's a hard thing to come back from. Even after. Even if you win the case, your kids are going to read about you in the news being dead. Adrienne is going to find out from a reporter. No, Raymond said. Adrienne is going to find out from me. Tonight, on a burner laptop, face to face, she's the only person on earth besides you and Willa who's going to know I'm alive. Frank nodded slowly and Desmond down. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. His son, 36 years old, a poet in Portland. The boy he'd called soft his whole life. The boy he'd told at 16, you can't make a living writing poems, son. The boy who'd written him a letter at 19 that began with the words, Dad, I think you've never actually looked at me. Raymond had read 3 sentences of that letter. Then he'd folded it up and put it in a drawer and never finished it. That letter was still in the drawer of his desk at the office. He'd thought about it maybe 4 times in 17 years. My son hasn't spoken to me in 2 years, Raymond said. He'll find out when the world finds out, and he'll grieve me for however long he grieves me. And when I come back, he'll have to decide what to do with the fact that I let him grieve. He picked up his coffee. It was lukewarm. That's the price I'm paying Frank for being the father I was. Frank said nothing for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand on Raymond's forearm. Just for a second. The way men touch each other when words have run out and the body has to say what the mouth can't. He pulled his hand back. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a set of keys. I've got a place. Motel off Route 7 in Danbury. Takes cash. Doesn't ask for ID if you don't make eye contact. I've been there before. Raymond didn't ask why. Frank stood up. He left 2 20s on the table. Enough for the meal and enough for the waitress to remember them kindly and not at all. They walked out into the parking lot. The November sun was trying to break through the clouds and failing. The light was thin and cold and the color of something that used to be beautiful. Damn. Raymond stopped at the truck. He turned around and looked back at the diner, at the cracked parking lot, at the highway beyond it where the emergency vehicles had gone. Somewhere out there, 14 miles southeast of Montauk, pieces of his airplane were settling on the ocean floor. A flight manifest with his name on it was being transmitted to news desks. Somewhere a producer was pulling his Forbes photograph from an archive. Somewhere a graphic was being built with his name and the word breaking underneath it. And somewhere in a house in Greenwich with new marble countertops and a wine cellar he'd built to her specifications and curtains she'd chosen, and a closet full of clothes he'd paid for his wife was about to get the phone call she'd been waiting for. The phone call that would make her a widow. The phone call she had paid for. Raymond got in the truck. Frank started the engine. They pulled out of the parking lot and turned north toward Danbury. Behind them, Raymond's phone buzzed again. He didn't look. He was thinking about Willa, about a unicorn notebook with a peeling horn, about a little girl who sat in a break room and watched the world through a window and wrote down everything she saw because nobody had ever told her it mattered. And it turned out it mattered more than anything. He was thinking about his father, about a welder in Baltimore who came home every night with burns on his arms and never complained. Who said to Raymond once when he was maybe 12, "The only thing a man really owns is what he pays attention to, son. Everything else can be taken." Raymond hadn't thought about that sentence in decades. It came back to him now in a pickup truck on a Connecticut highway with the taste of diner coffee in his mouth and the sound of his own death on the radio. Depression. The only thing a man really owns is what he pays attention to. He had paid attention to markets, to margins, to quarterly reports, to competitors, to opportunities, to every moving piece of a machine he'd built with his own hands from nothing. And he had not paid attention to the woman sleeping next to him, not to what she was becoming, not to what she was planning, not to the slow, quiet, patient work of a person who had decided that the only way to get what she wanted was to make sure he stopped existing. He had been an excellent provider. He had been a terrible witness. And the difference between those two things had almost killed him. Almost. Because a 9-year-old girl in a break room had been paying attention. Because a pilot named Thomas Hale had waved at a cleaning woman every morning for 2 years. Because kindness, the smallest kind, the kind that cost nothing, had built an alarm system that money couldn't buy. Frank turned onto Route 7. The motel was 3 miles ahead. 2 double beds, a television bolted to a particle board dresser, a carpet with a stain near the door. The next chapter of Raymond Garrett's life was about to begin in a $49 room. And the version of him that walked into that room was going to be very different from the version that eventually walked out. But that part comes later. For now, he sat in the passenger seat of a truck that smelled like coffee and old leather and watched the Connecticut woods go by. Bare trees, gray sky, the occasional house set back from the road with smoke coming from the chimney and a car in the driveway and a life inside that he knew nothing about. He thought about all the lives he knew nothing about, all the Lorraines he'd walked past, all the Willas he'd never looked down to see, all the small invisible people who held the world together while men like him flew over it. The truck turned into the motel parking lot. Frank killed the engine. They sat there for a moment. 2 old men in a pickup truck, one of them already a ghost as far as the world was concerned. "Ready?" Frank asked. "No," Raymond said. He opened the door anyway. The motel room smelled like carpet cleaner and regret, the kind of smell that gets into the walls and stays there layered over years of people who checked in because they had nowhere better to be. 2 double beds, a television bolted to a particle board dresser, a window with curtains that didn't quite close all the way, letting in a thin stripe of November light that fell across the carpet like a scar. The carpet itself had a stain near the door that looked like coffee, but probably wasn't. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed nearest the window. The mattress sagged under him. The springs made a sound that was almost human. He was still wearing the Brioni suit, still wearing the Patek Philippe, still carrying a phone that had not stopped buzzing since 8 o'clock that morning. Frank was setting up 2 laptops on the desk. The desk was the kind of furniture that exists only in motel rooms and police interrogation rooms. Thin, scratched, a surface designed to hold the weight of bad news. What are those "one's mine, one's yours"? Burner laptops. Bought them in cash last year for a different thing. Don't worry about it. "You've been ready for this." Frank didn't look up. He was plugging in cables connecting a mobile hotspot, doing the quiet mechanical work of a man who had spent 32 years preparing for situations that other people couldn't imagine. "I've been ready for something, Ray. Not this exactly, just something." The television was on with the sound off. CNN had it already. The graphic was simple. Blue background, white text. The kind of design that turns a man's life into a headline. Private plane carrying billionaire industrialists feared down off Long Island coast. They were using the Forbes photograph, the one from 2019. Raymond standing in front of a turbine at the Pittsburgh plant, arms crossed, jaw set. The photograph they always take of black men who build empires. The pose that says, "I made this and you will acknowledge it." He looked younger in the photograph, not because of his face, because of his eyes. The man in that photograph still believed in the woman waiting for him at home. The man in that photograph still thought his marriage was difficult, the way all marriages are difficult. The man in that photograph had no idea that the woman who'd chosen the butterscotch leather for his car interior was the same woman who was choosing which month to kill him. Raymond turned away from the screen. Frank. Yeah. Willa. What about her? Where is she right now? Frank pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke for 30 seconds in the low murmur of a man who'd given orders his whole adult life. Hung up. She's at a Holiday Inn in White Plains with her mother. My niece is sitting with them. They have food, they have cable. The mother knows nothing yet except that you asked her to lay low and you're paying her for the day. Willa knows something happened, but she doesn't know what. She's drawing in her notebook. What's she drawing? Frank almost smiled. The kind of smile that happens when something is too remarkable to process any other way. My niece said she's drawing the motel room. Every detail. The lamp, the curtains, the carpet pattern. She said the kid's a little FBI agent. Her words. Raymond looked at the ceiling. Water stains. Brown rings spreading outward from a point near the bathroom door, like the rings of a tree that had seen too many seasons. He thought about his own grandchildren, Lily and James, Adrian's kids in Denver, 6 and 4. He hadn't seen them since August. He'd missed James's 4th birthday for Singapore. He'd sent the check, the big one, the kind of check that buys forgiveness in families where the money flows one direction and the love is supposed to flow the other. It doesn't work that way. He knew that now. He'd probably known it for years. But knowing and admitting are two different countries, and the border between them is guarded by every excuse a man has ever built to avoid the truth about himself. His phone buzzed again. He picked it up, looked at the screen. 23 missed calls, 11 from Vivian, 4 from Leon, 3 from his executive assistant Patricia, 2 from his lawyer, 3 from numbers he didn't recognize, which meant the news had broken and reporters were already calling. There was one text from Vivian, sent 8 minutes after the plane went down. Baby, please tell me you're okay. Please call. Please. The word baby again. She hadn't called him baby in 4 years. He'd noticed. He'd told himself it was natural. He'd told himself that 30-year marriages outgrow pet names the way children outgrow shoes. Gradually, without ceremony. You don't notice the last time until it's long past. But she was using it now. Baby. The triple please. The lowercase intimacy of it. Designed to look like panic. Designed to sound like a woman who just heard the worst news of her life and was reaching for her husband with the only word that felt big enough. Some part of her had been writing this text in her head for years, rehearsing the performance of grief the way she rehearsed everything. The dinner parties, the charity galas, the way she laughed at his jokes in front of his board members, the way she touched his arm at fundraisers, a gesture so practiced it had become mechanical. A thing her hand did the way a clock's hand moves, not because it wants to, but because the mechanism demands it. Raymond set the phone face down on the nightstand. She's performing already, Frank said from the desk. He hadn't looked at the phone. He didn't need to. 40 years of friendship meant he could read the shape of Raymond's silence the way Raymond read boardrooms. Raymond nodded. The phone buzzed again. He let it. By 1 o'clock, the Coast Guard had recovered debris. Pieces of a Beechcraft King Air scattered across 2 miles of cold Atlantic water. A seat cushion, a section of fuselage, a briefcase that didn't belong to Raymond because Raymond's briefcase was sitting in the trunk of a town car in the Westchester Airport parking lot untouched, still holding the documents for a Zurich meeting that would never happen. By 2 o'clock, they were calling it presumed loss of life. By 3 o'clock, Vivian had given her first statement on the front lawn of the house in Greenwich. Raymond watched it on the laptop. Frank sat beside him on the bed, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. 2 men in a motel room watching a woman perform the most important scene of her life. She was wearing a black coat, floor length, Italian wool. The cut was sharp, modern. The kind of coat you see in the windows of shops on Madison Avenue, the kind that costs more than Lorraine Beckett made in 3 months. Frank pointed at the screen. Look at the coat, Ray. Look at the cut. That coat is brand new. That coat has been waiting in a closet. Raymond looked. He saw it. The coat had no wear on the cuffs, no creases at the elbows. The buttons still had that manufactured tightness, the way buttons sit when they've never been fastened in weather. A coat that had been purchased hung in a garment bag and stored in a closet for exactly this moment. She'd bought a morning coat before the murder. The realization should have hit him like a fist. Instead, it settled over him like something cold and heavy, a blanket made of iron. The weight of understanding that the woman he'd shared a bed with for 31 years had gone shopping for the outfit she'd wear to announce his death. Vivian was crying on the screen. She was crying the way Raymond had seen her cry at her father's funeral in 2004. He remembered that funeral. He remembered thinking she was the bravest woman he'd ever met, holding it together for her mother, for her sister, dabbing her eyes only when the camera swung her way. He realized now, watching the laptop in a motel room in Danbury, that 2004 had been a rehearsal. She'd been rehearsing then. She'd been rehearsing for this. Some women cry, some women perform crying. Raymond had spent 31 years unable to tell the difference because he'd never wanted to know. Because knowing would have meant looking at his marriage the way he looked at a balance sheet with clear eyes and no sentiment, and the numbers would not have added up. Leon was standing behind her on the lawn, one hand on her shoulder, not the hand of a brother-in-law offering comfort, the hand of a man who was waiting for the cameras to turn off so he could put his arms somewhere else. Raymond watched Leon's face in the background of the frame. The mouth was sad, the eyes weren't. The eyes were doing math, adding up numbers, calculating timelines, running projections the way a man runs projections when the payout is finally within reach. Raymond had pulled Leon out of bankruptcy in 2016, had written the check without blinking, had put Leon's name on 3 foundations because Vivian had begged him. Give him something to feel proud of, Ray. He's my brother. He's lost everything. Let him have this one thing. Raymond had given Leon a seat at the table, and Leon had used that seat to plan the murder. That was the part that moved through Raymond like a slow poison. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayal he could understand. He was a man who'd built a fortune in industries where betrayal was just another word for Tuesday. But the intimacy of it. The fact that Leon had sat at his dinner table, eaten his food, laughed at his jokes, asked about his flight schedule with the easy curiosity of a family member making conversation, all while calculating the logistics of his death. Easter dinner, last month. Leon across the table holding a glass of wine Raymond had paid for, asking questions. When are you heading to Zurich next? Which airport? Still flying with Hale? You ever worry about those small planes over the Atlantic? Raymond had answered every question with the generosity of a man who believed he was talking to family. He had handed his own brother-in-law the blueprint to his murder over ham and scalloped potatoes. He closed the laptop. He couldn't watch anymore. Not yet. Frank, he said. Yeah, I want to talk to Adrian tonight. Frank nodded. He'd already set up the burner laptop for video calls, already configured the VPN, already done the things that men like Frank do when they've spent their careers building systems to protect people who don't know they need protecting. Raymond waited until 9 o'clock. He waited because he needed the time, not to prepare what he would say. He didn't have words prepared. He'd never had words prepared for any conversation that actually mattered. The boardroom speeches, the investor presentations, the keynote addresses, those he could write in his sleep. But the conversations with his children had always found him empty-handed. He thought about Adrian while he waited. 38 years old, living in Denver with Michael and the kids, the daughter who had tried to warn him. She'd been 23 when she said it. They were at the house in Greenwich, Thanksgiving. Vivian had gone to bed early with a headache that Raymond now understood was probably a phone call she needed to make in private. Adrian had been helping him clear the dishes. Standing at the sink with her sleeves rolled up, washing a gravy boat that had been her grandmother's, Raymond's mother's, the one piece of china that had survived the move from Baltimore. Dad, she'd said, Eleanor is performative. He hadn't known what that word meant in that context. He'd asked her to explain. She's playing a part, Dad. She's been playing a part the whole time. I don't know how you don't see it. He'd told Adrian she was being unfair. He'd told her marriage was complicated. He told her she didn't understand what it took to build a life with someone over 30 years. He'd been so good at defending his wife to his own daughter. So good at it. The way a man is good at something he practices every day without realizing he's practicing. He called Adrienne at 9:14. The video came through on the burner laptop. She picked up on the second ring. He saw her face before she saw his. She'd been crying. Not the perform crying, the other kind. The kind that hollows out a 38-year-old woman until she looks like a child again. The kind that strips away every year of adulthood and every layer of composure and leaves behind the raw, unfinished thing underneath. Dad, that one word, it took everything he had not to break in front of her. Everything. 40 years of holding himself together. 40 years of being the man who didn't crack. 40 years of carrying weight the way his father had taught him silently without complaint, because that's what men from their neighborhood did. All of it nearly came apart on a single syllable from his daughter's mouth. Adrienne, listen to me. I'm alive. I'm alive, sweetheart. I'm safe. Her face went through 4 different shapes in 3 seconds. Disbelief, rage, relief, and then finally something that looked like grief moving in the wrong direction. Grief in reverse. Grief unwinding itself. Like watching a wave pull back from the shore, all the destruction retracting, the water returning to where it came from. She didn't speak for almost a minute. She just sat there, hand over her mouth, eyes wide and wet and locked on his. The laptop screen between them was a window into a room in Denver where a woman was watching her father come back from the dead. You're alive. I'm alive. Where are you? I can't say. Not on this call. I'll tell you when this is over. Dad? Yeah, sweetheart. It was her, wasn't it? He nodded. He didn't trust himself to say it out loud yet. The words were there. The sentence was formed. But some sentences, once you say them out loud, become real in a way they weren't before. And he wasn't ready for that reality yet. Not all of it. Not all at once. Adrienne closed her eyes. Tears ran down the sides of her nose. She didn't wipe them. She just sat there with her eyes closed, breathing the way she used to breathe as a little girl when she was trying not to throw up. Short breaths, controlled. The breathing of a child who had learned early that falling apart was something you did in private. She'd learned that from him. He understood that now. She'd learned it watching her father hold himself together at every funeral, every setback, every disappointment. She'd learned that composure was the price of admission to the Garrett family, and she'd paid it her whole life. I knew, she whispered. Dad, I knew. I've known for years. I didn't have proof. I just had a feeling. And every time I tried to tell you, you'd defend her. She opened her eyes. And I'd go home and tell Michael my own father thinks I'm crazy. And Michael would say, give it time. And we'd give it time. And nothing changed. And I stopped calling as often. And you told yourself I was busy. You told yourself I was raising 2 small kids and didn't have time for long phone calls. She paused. But that wasn't it, Dad. I wasn't busy. I was tired. Tired of watching you love someone who was slowly taking you apart. And tired of being the daughter who couldn't make you see it. Raymond took that. He took every word of it. He sat there in a motel room in Connecticut with a stain on the carpet and a television bolted to the dresser and a view of a parking lot where someone's minivan was parked under a light that flickered every 4 seconds. And he let his daughter say the things she'd needed to say for 10 years. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He didn't soften any of it. He didn't interrupt. For the first time in his adult life, Raymond Garrett listened. Not the way he listened in boardrooms, which was really just waiting for his turn to speak. Not the way he listened to earnings calls, which was really just scanning for numbers. He listened the way Lorraine's daughter listened. With everything. With the full weight of his attention. And he understood sitting there at a particle board desk in a $49 room that he had spent 31 years interrupting his own daughter's grief to manage his own discomfort. He had done it at her 6th birthday party when her hamster died, and she'd cried at the table and he'd said, "Come on now, sweetheart, we'll get you a new one." He had done it at 14 when her best friend's mother got sick, and Adrienne had wanted to talk about death, and he changed the subject because death made him think about Baltimore and his father's hands and the church on North Avenue and all the things he'd put in a box and closed the lid on. He had done it at 23 when she tried to warn him about Vivian, and he'd told her she was being unfair. He had been an interrupter of grief. That was the sentence that landed in him like a nail driven into wood. Not with force, with precision. An interrupter of grief. A man who couldn't sit with the pain of the people he loved because their pain made him feel helpless. And helplessness was the one thing Raymond Garrett had never learned to carry. He could carry pressure, he could carry responsibility, he could carry the expectations of 400 employees and 11 board members and 2 ex-presidents who sent him Christmas cards. But he could not carry helplessness. It was too much like being 12 years old in East Baltimore, watching his father come home with burns on his arms, unable to do anything about it. So he interrupted. He fixed. He solved. He redirected. He turned grief into problems and problems into action because action was the only language he'd ever been fluent in. And his daughter had been drowning in his efficiency for 38 years. When Adrienne was done, she was crying so hard her shoulders were shaking. Small, silent shaking. The kind that happens when the sound has run out but the body keeps going. Raymond waited. He let her cry. He sat in the silence and the discomfort and the helplessness, and he did not try to fix it. He just sat there, present, useless, and somehow more useful than he had ever been in his daughter's life. Dad. Yes, sweetheart. How did you find out? A little girl told me, right there on the tarmac. 9 years old. Daughter of the cleaning woman at the terminal. Adrienne laughed. A wet, broken laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. A sound the body makes when it doesn't know whether to grieve or celebrate and decides to do both at the same time. Of course it was a kid. Of course it was. Adults are too well-mannered to tell rich men the truth, Dad. We learned that. It's the first lesson rich families teach. You don't tell Daddy he's wrong. You don't tell Daddy his wife is dangerous. You smile. You take the check. You go home and cry in your own kitchen. Raymond didn't have a response to that. There wasn't one. Some truths arrive without a return address. You can't send them back. You can only stand there holding them. Adrienne wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked like she was 12 years old. He'd forgotten she had that face. He'd forgotten she'd ever been 12. He'd forgotten the girl in the kitchen washing the gravy boat who'd tried to tell him something true and been sent away with a lecture about the complexity of marriage. What do you need from me, Dad? Nothing. I need you to grieve me on the news for a few days. I need you to not tell Michael. Not yet. Not because I don't trust him. Because you can't pretend the way I'm asking you to pretend if anybody's watching you do it. I need you to be a daughter whose father just died. Out there in public. In here with me 3 times a day on this laptop. You get to be a daughter whose father just came back to her. She nodded slowly. And the boys are too young to act. Adrienne, you tell them whatever you need to tell them. You're their mother. You know better than I ever did. She looked at him for a long time. Through the screen, across 1,000 miles of fiber optic cable and encrypted signal, through 38 years of a relationship that had been built on love and damaged by absence and was now being rebuilt in a motel room, one honest sentence at a time. Dad. Yeah. This is the most honest you've ever been with me. I know it took your wife trying to kill you to get here. I know. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard you say. He nodded. He couldn't speak. She closed her eyes again. When she opened them, something had shifted. He could see it. Some calculation she'd been carrying her whole life. Some equation she'd been trying to solve since she was old enough to understand that her father's love came with conditions he didn't know he was setting. That equation had just resolved itself. Dad, listen to me. When you come back, when all of this is over, I don't want a bigger check. I don't want a trust adjustment. I don't want a place on a board. She leaned forward. I want you to come to Denver. I want you to sleep in our guest room. I want you to learn how to make pancakes with Lily on a Saturday morning. I want you to take James to the park. I want 1 full week of you in my life with no phone, no plane, no driver. She paused. And then we'll see. He nodded. He couldn't speak. Dad. Yeah, say it. Say you'll come. I'll come. A full week. A full week. Pancakes. Pancakes. She laughed again. A real laugh this time. Small. A little crooked. But real. The first real sound between them in years. Okay, Dad. Okay. I'll be your widow for a while. I'm not going to like it. but I'll do it. After he hung up, Raymond sat in the dark for a long time. Frank had gone out for sandwiches. The motel room was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of a truck downshifting on the highway. He thought about all the calls he'd taken in his life. The deals, the mergers, the condolences, the congratulations. The boardroom calls at 3 in the morning from Tokyo. The calls that had made him rich. The calls that had made him important. None of them had ever made him this tired, or this awake. He understood now, sitting in the dark of a motel he wouldn't remember the name of by Christmas, that he had spent 40 years building a life he wasn't living in. And it was going to take everything he had left to move in. The funeral was on a Thursday. Vivian wore black again, a different coat this time. She'd cycled through her mourning wardrobe in 3 days, which struck Raymond as both impressive and horrifying. The logistics of grief, the costuming of widowhood. She'd planned it the way she planned dinner parties. Every detail considered, every angle covered. She'd cried on 3 networks worth of cameras by then, and the country had decided by some quiet consensus that she was handling it with grace. There were op-eds, there were tributes. There was a piece in the Times Sunday section about the widow of the industrialist, the woman who'd stood beside him for 31 years, the woman who'd lost not just a husband, but as she put it in one of the interviews, my best friend, my partner, my reason to come home. Raymond watched it on a laptop in a borrowed cabin in the Adirondacks. Frank had a cousin who hunted up there. The cousin had been told nothing, just that some old friend needs a place to disappear for a couple weeks. The cabin had no television and no internet, but the burner laptops worked on the hotspot, and that was enough. The cabin was small. 1 room, a wood stove, a kitchen that was really just a counter with a propane burner and a cast iron pan. The bed was narrow and the mattress was harder than anything Raymond had slept on since his childhood bedroom in Baltimore, where he'd shared a full-size mattress with his cousin Marcus every summer until he was 14. He watched his own funeral the way a man watches a movie he's already seen. He knew the lines, he knew the music. He'd lived inside the marriage long enough to recognize the score. The church was in Greenwich, the same church where they'd renewed their vows in 2017. The same pews, the same altar, the same stained glass that threw colored light across the floor in the late morning. Vivian had chosen that church for the renewal ceremony because she said it was where they'd built their life. Raymond understood now that she'd been scouting the location. The thing that surprised him wasn't her performance. By now he'd learned to watch her the way Frank watched suspects, not listening to what she said, watching what her body did when she thought the cameras were somewhere else, the way her shoulders relaxed between takes, the way she checked her phone under the pew, the way she leaned toward Leon during the eulogy with a familiarity that was too practiced to be new. The thing that surprised him was the empty pew. 3rd row, left side, family section. There was a gap where a body should have been. Desmond, his son, 36 years old, a poet in Portland. The boy Raymond had called soft his whole life. Not to his face, not always, but in the silences between them, in the way he talked about Adrian's accomplishments and paused before mentioning Desmond's. In the way he'd introduced Adrian at company events as my daughter the architect and introduced Desmond as my son, he's in Portland. The gap after Portland, the missing word, the absent descriptor. That gap was a room Desmond had been living in his entire adult life. A room with no furniture. A room his father had built and never bothered to fill. Desmond had written him a letter at 19. Raymond had read 3 sentences of it. Dad, I think you've never actually looked at me. He'd folded it up, put it in a drawer. 17 years, 4 times in 17 years he'd thought about it. And each time he'd told himself he'd read it later. Later. The word men use when they mean never but don't want to hear themselves say it. Desmond had not come to the funeral. Vivian had told the cameras with a small dignified sadness that Raymond now recognized as another shade of her performance, Desmond is grieving in his own way. We're respecting that. Raymond read between the lines. Desmond had refused to perform for his stepmother. Desmond the poet, the soft one, the one Raymond had been quietly ashamed of for 20 years, was the only person in his bloodline who had refused to fake anything. The empty pew, the absent son, the boy who wouldn't play the part. Raymond sat in the cabin and stared at the screen and understood that his son, the one he'd underestimated for 2 decades, was the one who'd seen Vivian most clearly. Because poets watch the way scientists measure. They don't look for what they want to find. They look for what's there. And Desmond had looked at his stepmother and seen what was there. And he'd done the only honest thing available to him. He'd stayed home. Raymond closed the laptop. He sat in front of the wood stove for a long time and watched the fire move. By the second week, Vivian had started spending. Frank's people were tracking it. There were ways, legal ways, the kind of ways that a man who'd spent 32 years in federal law enforcement knows about and doesn't discuss in detail because the details are boring and the results are what matter. She'd already met twice with the estate attorney. She'd already initiated a transfer of 3 properties into a holding company in her own name. She'd already had Leon over to the house in Greenwich for what the security log called a private dinner. 7 hours, 2 bottles of wine, neither of them left until 2 in the morning. She'd already ordered new towels. That was the detail that broke something loose in Raymond. Not the affair, not the murder plot, not the will, not the properties. The towels. He'd always hated the towels in the master bathroom. Thick, white Egyptian cotton that felt like sandpaper to him, but that Vivian insisted were luxurious. He'd mentioned it once, maybe in 2019. She'd smiled and said, "You'll get used to them." He never did. He used the towels in the guest bathroom instead. Thinner, softer. The towels nobody else touched because nobody ever stayed in the guest room because Vivian didn't like having guests who stayed past dessert. 3 days after burying him, she'd replaced every towel in the house. The new ones were sage green. He'd never seen sage green towels in their house. He'd never known she wanted sage green towels. She'd never mentioned it. She'd been living in a house with towels she didn't want, married to a man she didn't want, waiting for the day she could replace both. Raymond sat in the cabin and laughed out loud. The kind of laugh that comes out of a man when he's been holding something for too long and finally has somewhere to put it down. He laughed until he was crying. He laughed until Frank came in from chopping wood and asked him what was so funny, and he couldn't even explain it. He just kept saying, "The towels, Frank." The towels? And Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then Frank started laughing too. Because what else do you do? 2 grown men in a hunting cabin in the Adirondacks laughing about bath towels while a country grieved a man who wasn't dead. That was the night Raymond slept 11 hours. He hadn't slept 11 hours since college. Since the dorm room at Fordham where he and Frank had argued about Miles Davis and John Coltrane and fallen asleep with the radio still on. Since the last time his body had trusted the world enough to let go completely. He woke up at 9 in the morning to the sound of a woodpecker outside the window. And for a single confused second, he didn't know where he was. Didn't know what day it was. Didn't know if his wife was downstairs making coffee or whether she was in Greenwich choosing throw pillows for a sofa he'd been buried under. And then he remembered. And he lay there in the unfamiliar bed and felt something he had not felt since he was 19 years old. Unscheduled. Not free. Free was too big a word. He wasn't free. He was technically still married to a woman who was trying to inherit his estate. He had 3 weeks of theater to perform before he came back from the dead. He had a son he hadn't spoken to in 2 years and a daughter he was learning how to be a father to in real time over a laptop. And he had a 9-year-old girl in a Holiday Inn who was the reason any of this was happening at all. He wasn't free, but he was unscheduled. His calendar for the first time since 1978 had nothing on it. No flights, no meetings, no dinners, no wife, no press, no board. Just him and a wood stove and a woodpecker and the sound of his own breath in a room that smelled like cedar and old wool. He got up. He made coffee on the propane stove. He went outside in a borrowed flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too big and stood on the porch in boots that weren't his and watched the steam come off the surface of the lake. The lake was perfectly still. The trees on the far shore were bare. The sky was the color of milk. Somewhere a crow was having an argument with another crow about something that mattered deeply to crows and not at all to anyone else. Raymond stood there with his coffee and thought about Willa. He'd been thinking about Willa every day. Every morning when he woke up, and every night before the sleeping pills Frank had brought him pulled him under. She was the first thought and the last thought and most of the thoughts in between. Frank had set up a system. Lorraine and Willa were no longer at the Holiday Inn. They were in a small rental house in upstate New York that Frank had arranged through a third party. Lorraine had been told only that Mr. Garrett wanted to make sure they were safe and that someone would be in touch when it was time. Lorraine had not asked questions. Lorraine was the kind of woman who had learned in her 43 years on Earth that when a powerful man tells you to lay low, you lay low and you don't ask why. Because asking why is a luxury reserved for people who have options. And Lorraine Beckett, a single mother who cleaned bathrooms at a private airport, had never been a woman with options. But Willa knew. Willa had figured it out within the first 3 days. Frank's niece had reported it carefully, the way people report strange phenomena they don't fully understand. The kid asked me a question today. Straight face, no emotion, like she was checking a fact for a school paper. What did she ask? Is Mr. Garrett alive? Frank's niece hadn't known what to say. She'd been told to keep Lorraine and Willa comfortable, not to manage a 9-year-old's intelligence operation. Willa had made it easy for her. It's okay. I won't tell my mom. I just need to know. And Frank's niece had nodded once, and Willa had nodded back, and the 9-year-old had gone back to her drawing. That was the report Frank had brought to the cabin on the 4th day. Raymond had heard it and gone outside and stood by the lake for an hour. Just standing, not thinking, or thinking so much that it all canceled out into a kind of white noise, the way 1,000 instruments playing at once becomes a single sound that has no edges. He understood, standing on that porch with the steam rising off the water, that the most important relationship he was going to build in the rest of his life was with a child who was not his blood, whose mother cleaned bathrooms for a living, who had saved him without knowing the full size of what she was saving. He understood that he owed her something he didn't have a name for yet. Not money. Money was easy. Money was the language of every wrong move he'd made for 40 years. He'd already decided on the second night in the cabin that Willa and Lorraine would be set for life. College for Willa, a home for Lorraine, healthcare, the whole architecture. That part was settled. The checkbook part was always settled. Raymond Garrett could solve any problem that had a number attached to it. That was his gift. That was also his curse. Because when you can solve everything with money, you start to believe that everything can be solved. And the things that can't, the things that require presence and patience, and the slow, unglamorous work of showing up those things, atrophy. Those muscles die. The harder thing was the question he couldn't stop asking himself. What kind of man do I want to be in this child's memory? Because she was going to remember him for the rest of her life. She was going to tell this story to her own children one day. The story of the morning she pulled a billionaire off a plane. And the way she told it, the tone of it, the warmth or coldness of it, would depend entirely on who he became in the next 30 years. Not the next 30 days, the next 30 years. He sat back down inside. He picked up the burner laptop. He opened a blank document. He started a list. It wasn't a business list. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a plan with milestones and deliverables and quarterly checkpoints. It was just names. Adrienne, Desmond, Lily, James, Willa, Lorraine, Frank, 7 names. He looked at the list for a long time. He looked at it the way he'd looked at balance sheets that told him difficult truths. The way he'd looked at profit and loss statements that didn't lie even when he wanted them to. 7 names. That was it. That was the whole list. 31 years of marriage, 40 years of building, 400 employees, 6 homes, 11 board seats, 2 ex-presidents on his Christmas card list, a Forbes cover, a foundation with his name on the building, a net worth that had commas in places most people's numbers don't reach. And the list of people he actually owed something real to, something that couldn't be wired or transferred or written off, was 7 names long. He didn't feel sad about it. That was the strange part. He expected sadness. He expected the kind of grief that comes with realizing your empire was built on a foundation of absence and your legacy was made of all the rooms you weren't in. Instead, he felt clear. For the first time in his adult life, Raymond Garrett felt clear. The way water looks when the mud settles, the way a morning looks when the fog lifts, the way a man's life looks when he finally stops telling himself the stories that kept him comfortable and starts reading the page that's actually in front of him. 7 names. He could do something with 7 names. He could build something with 7 names that was worth more than everything he'd built before. He closed the laptop. He went outside again. The woodpecker was still working on a dead pine across the clearing. Methodical, patient, the kind of persistence that doesn't care whether anyone's watching. The lake was completely still, not a ripple. The reflection of the far shore was so perfect, it was hard to tell which was real and which was the mirror. He had 3 weeks before he came back from the dead. he intended to use them. He stood on the porch with his coffee going cold in his hand and the November air settling around him like something that had been waiting for him to be still enough to feel it. And he thought about his father, the welder from Baltimore, the man with the burned arms who never complained. His father had died in 1991, heart attack at 58, on a Tuesday morning, in the kitchen, making coffee, the same kitchen where Raymond had eaten breakfast every morning of his childhood. His mother found him on the floor with the coffee pot still in his hand. She said later that the coffee hadn't even finished brewing. That's how fast it was. Raymond had been 31, already building, already climbing, already becoming the man on the magazine cover. He'd flown to Baltimore for the funeral and flown back the same night because he had a meeting the next morning. He told himself his father would have understood. His father was a practical man. His father valued work. But standing on a porch in the Adirondacks 30 years later, Raymond understood something he'd been avoiding since that night flight back from Baltimore. His father wouldn't have understood. His father would have been heartbroken. His father, the practical man, the quiet man, the man who never said I love you because men from his generation and his neighborhood didn't say it, that man would have wanted his son to stay, to sit in the kitchen, to drink the coffee his wife couldn't stop brewing because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. To be there, just there. Not important, not productive, just present. And Raymond hadn't stayed. He'd left. He'd always left. Every room, every moment, every time the world asked him to be still, he'd found a reason to move. And he'd called it ambition. And the world had agreed with him because the world rewards men who move and forgets the people they leave behind. The woodpecker stopped. The silence that followed was enormous. The kind of silence that has weight and texture. The kind you could hold in your hands if your hands were open. Raymond's hands were open. For the first time in a very long time, he was holding nothing. No phone, no briefcase, no contract, no plan. Just a cup of cold coffee and a list of 7 names in the beginning of something he didn't have a word for yet. He came back on a Tuesday. There was no press conference, no live broadcast, no podium with microphones arranged in a row like soldiers, no publicist managing the optics, no prepared statement reviewed by lawyers and edited by a communications team and tested on a focus group. There was a courthouse in White Plains, a federal prosecutor named Diane Ortega, who had been working with Frank for 16 days, and a sealed indictment that named 4 people. Vivian Garrett, Leon Ashford, a man named Peter Hale, the brother of Captain Thomas Hale, who had taken his brother's place in the cockpit, wearing his brother's uniform and his brother's watch and walking his brother's walk down the jetway. And a maintenance contractor in Farmingdale named William Dewey, who had been paid $48,000 in cash to look the other way during a pre-flight inspection on a Beechcraft King Air that was never supposed to land. 4 people, 4 names on a document that would become public record in newspaper headlines and podcast episodes and the kind of story that strangers tell each other at dinner parties for years. Did you hear about the billionaire whose wife tried to kill him? Did you hear it was the cleaning lady's daughter who saved him? Can you believe it? Raymond had read the indictment once, in the cabin, at the kitchen table, with coffee that Frank had made too strong and a wood stove that needed another log. He'd read it the way he used to read contracts. Carefully, clinically, looking for the structure underneath the language, looking for the story the words were trying to tell. The story was simple. Vivian had met Leon for dinner at a restaurant in Stamford in March, 7 months before the plane went down, a Tuesday night. She'd told Raymond she was having dinner with her college roommate. He hadn't asked which roommate. He hadn't asked anything. He'd been on a call with Tokyo and waved her out the door the way you wave away a waiter who comes too early with the check. Over dinner, Vivian and Leon had discussed money. Not the way families discuss money with vague references to budgets and expenses and the cost of things. The way conspirators discuss money. Specifically. Precisely. With numbers and timelines and contingencies. The prenup was the problem. Raymond had signed it in 1993 before the first company went public, before the fortune existed in its current form. But the trust structure his father's friend in Baltimore had built, the one that old lawyer had designed for free, because he'd known Raymond's father and believed in the boy, that structure was airtight. Vivian would walk away with 12 to 15% in a divorce. A fortune by any normal standard. A fraction by hers. Leon had been the one to suggest the alternative, or so the indictment alleged. Leon, who had been pulled out of bankruptcy by Raymond's money. Leon, whose daughter's tuition was paid by Raymond's generosity. Leon, who sat on 3 foundation boards because Vivian had said give him something to feel proud of. Leon had a friend who knew a man who had a brother. That was how these things worked. Not in dramatic meetings in dark rooms, in casual conversations at bars, in phone calls that lasted 90 seconds, in the quiet arithmetic of men who had decided that another man's life was worth less than the number attached to it. Peter Hale had agreed to fly the plane for $50,000. He was Thomas Hale's younger brother. Same build, same walk. Close enough in the face that from a distance through a cockpit window on a cold November morning, you wouldn't notice the difference. Unless you were a 9-year-old girl who had spent 6 months watching every pilot who walked through that terminal and writing down everything she saw in a notebook with a unicorn on the cover. Peter Hale had not known he was going to die. That was the detail that stayed with Raymond longest. Peter Hale had been told the plane would develop a mechanical issue over the Atlantic, that he would declare an emergency, that the plane would go down in controlled conditions near a predetermined point, that a boat would be waiting, that he would disappear into a new life with $50,000 and a name that wasn't his. None of that was true. The plane was rigged to fail catastrophically. There was no boat. There was no new life. Peter Hale was as much a victim as Raymond was supposed to be. A man killed by people who considered him disposable. A tool used and discarded. Raymond thought about Peter Hale more than he expected to. In the weeks that followed, in the months that followed, he would find himself lying awake at 3 in the morning, thinking about a man he'd never met who had died in a seat that was meant for him. A man who had a brother who waved at cleaning women. A man who had agreed to do a terrible thing for money and been betrayed by the people who hired him. It didn't make Peter Hale innocent, but it made him human. And Raymond had learned in a cabin in the Adirondacks with a list of 7 names on a laptop that being human was more complicated than any contract he'd ever read. Vivian was arrested at 7:40 in the morning, in the kitchen of the house in Greenwich, the house with the new towels and the new curtains and the new throw pillows on the sofa that Raymond had paid for and never chosen. She was pouring coffee into a mug that said "World's Okayest Wife." It had been a gag gift from her sister 3 Christmases ago. She kept it on the counter the whole time. She'd been drinking from it every morning while she planned her husband's murder. The irony of it was so complete it almost felt designed, as if the universe had been building toward that single image. A woman in a Greenwich kitchen pouring coffee into a joke mug, wearing silk pajamas that cost more than Lorraine Beckett's monthly rent, looking up to find 2 federal agents at her door. Raymond was not there for the arrest. He'd asked specifically not to be. Frank had told him, "Ray, you've earned the right to watch." And Raymond had said, "Frank, I've watched enough. I don't need to see her face. I need to never see her face again." Not out of hatred. He wanted to be clear about that. Not out of revenge or anger or the kind of cold satisfaction that men in movies feel when the villain is caught. Out of something simpler. Out of the understanding that some people, when they show you who they really are, deserve to be believed the first time and never granted a second audience. He had given Vivian 31 years of audiences. 31 years of watching her perform and believing the performance was real. 31 years of applauding her act because the alternative was admitting he'd married a stranger. He was done watching. He was done being an audience of one in a theater he'd built and paid for and never realized he was sitting in. The morning of the arrest, Raymond was in a hotel room in White Plains. A decent hotel this time. Not a motel with carpet stains and duct tape booths. Frank had insisted. "You've spent 3 weeks in places that would make a prison warden wince. Sleep in a real bed tonight." Raymond had slept in the real bed. He'd slept 5 hours, which was less than the 11 he'd gotten in the cabin, but more than the 2 he'd been averaging since he decided to come back. Sleep, it turned out, was easier when you were hiding from the world than when you were about to re-enter it. He watched the arrest on a live feed from a camera Frank had arranged. He watched for 11 seconds, long enough to see the door open, long enough to see Vivian's face change, long enough to see the mug still in her hand, coffee sloshing over the rim, a dark stain spreading across the white marble counter she'd had installed last spring. Then he closed the laptop. 11 seconds was enough. 11 seconds was more than enough. He called Frank. "It's done. It's done." Leon. Picked up 20 minutes ago, at his apartment in Stamford. He was on the phone with a real estate agent looking at properties in Vale. With your money, Raymond almost laughed. Almost. The laugh got halfway up his throat and stopped because there was nothing funny about any of it, and the habit of finding humor in destruction was a defense mechanism he was trying to retire along with everything else. He showered. He shaved the 4-day beard down to something presentable. He put on clothes Frank had bought him from a department store in Danbury. Khakis, a blue button-down, shoes that were comfortable and unremarkable. The clothes of a man with nowhere important to be and nobody important to impress. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. He looked different. Not older, not younger. Different, like a house after a renovation. Same structure, same bones. But the wallpaper was gone and the windows were bigger and the light was coming in from directions it hadn't been able to reach before. He left the hotel at 10:15. Frank drove him to the airport. Not Westchester. He would never fly out of Westchester again. LaGuardia, Terminal B. The same terminal where ordinary people bought overpriced sandwiches and argued with gate agents about seat assignments and fell asleep in plastic chairs waiting for flights that were always delayed. Raymond bought a ticket at the counter. Commercial, coach, window seat. He paid with a credit card under his own name and watched the gate agent's face when she scanned his ID. She looked at the screen. She looked at him. She looked at the screen again. She looked at him a second time. Her mouth opened slightly. Her hand, the one holding his boarding pass, was trembling. The news had broken 6 hours earlier. Every network, every website, every push notification on every phone in the country. Industrialist Raymond Garrett found alive. Plane crash investigation, now murder conspiracy. Wife among those charged. The gate agent handed him his boarding pass. She didn't say anything. What do you say to a man you watched being eulogized on television 2 weeks ago? What words exist for that moment? She handed him the pass, and her hand shook and her eyes were wide, and that was the entire interaction. Raymond took the boarding pass and walked to the gate. He sat in a plastic chair. He waited for his flight the way everyone else waited for their flights. He watched the departure board. He watched people walk past. He watched a child throw a tantrum near the Hudson News. He watched a couple argue quietly over a shared armrest. He watched the world happen at the speed it always happened, and he realized he'd never watched it before. Not from this angle, not from a plastic chair, not from the middle of it. He'd always been above it, in the private terminal, in the first-class lounge, behind the curtain, behind the glass, looking down at the tarmac from a cockpit window or a VIP suite, watching the ordinary world the way you watch traffic from a high floor. Aware of it, not part of it. Now he was part of it, sitting in a plastic chair with a boarding pass in his hand and no one picking him up on the other side except his daughter. On the plane, the woman next to him was reading a paperback novel and eating peanuts out of a small foil bag. She didn't recognize him. He had the baseball cap pulled low, the department store clothes. He looked like somebody's grandfather flying out to see the kids, which as it turned out was exactly what he was. The flight was 4 hours. He didn't sleep. He didn't read. He didn't pull out a laptop or a phone or any of the devices he'd spent 40 years hiding behind. He looked out the window. He watched the country pass below him, the patchwork of farms in Pennsylvania, the brown flatness of the Midwest, the mountains rising in Colorado like a promise that the world had more shapes than the ones he knew. He thought about what he was flying toward. Not Denver. Denver was just a city. He was flying toward a guest room in his daughter's house, a room with a bed he'd never slept in, and a closet he'd never opened, and a window that looked out on a backyard where his grandchildren played games he'd never learned the rules to. He was flying toward pancakes. That was the thought that kept coming back. Pancakes, the most ordinary thing in the world. Flour and eggs and milk and a hot pan and a 6-year-old girl who knew more about bubbles than he knew about anything that mattered. Adrienne met him at baggage claim. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing near the carousel, scanning the crowd with the focus of a woman who was looking for someone she was afraid might not be real. The way you look for someone you've only seen on a screen for 3 weeks. The way you look when you're not entirely sure the person you're waiting for isn't still dead. He walked toward her. She saw him. She didn't say anything. She just walked up and put her arms around him and held on. Long enough that people started to walk around them. Long enough that the man at the rental car counter looked over twice. Long enough that a security guard took a step forward and then stopped because whatever was happening between these two people was clearly not a security issue. It was something else, something older, something that had been waiting a long time to happen. Raymond held his daughter. He held her the way he should have held her when she was 6 and the hamster died. The way he should have held her at 14 when her best friend's mother got sick. The way he should have held her at 23 when she tried to tell him the truth and he sent her away with a lecture. He held her the way his father had never held him, because his father hadn't known how, because the men in their family going back generations had loved fiercely and expressed it poorly and carried the gap between the two like a wound they couldn't locate. He was going to close that gap, starting now, starting in a baggage claim in Denver with fluorescent lights overhead and a carousel going around empty because everyone else had already gotten their bags and gone. She drove him home. Michael was at the house. Michael shook his hand, the handshake of a son-in-law who'd watched his father-in-law die on television and come back from the dead in a federal investigation and wasn't entirely sure what the protocol was for this situation. "Welcome, Arthur," Michael said, then caught himself. "Raymond." "Welcome, Raymond." Raymond looked at him. Michael, 40 years old, a good man, a quiet man, an engineer who designed bridges for the Colorado Department of Transportation, a man who built things that held weight. Raymond had never particularly appreciated that about Michael. He'd never particularly appreciated anything about Michael because Michael didn't operate at the scale Raymond considered significant. But standing in the doorway of his daughter's house, Raymond understood something about scale that he'd been getting wrong his entire life. Michael built bridges that people drove across every day without thinking about them. Bridges that held minivans and school buses and trucks full of groceries. Bridges that didn't make anyone rich or famous, but kept the world connected at the places where it would otherwise fall apart. That was significance. That was the kind of building that mattered, not the kind that put your name on a magazine cover, the kind that held weight quietly and never asked for credit. "Thank you, son," Raymond said. Michael's face did something Raymond had never seen it do before. It softened. The tight, careful expression of a man who'd spent 12 years being polite to a father-in-law who'd never fully accepted him, that expression melted. Like ice in a glass. Like something frozen finally reaching the temperature it needed to change form. Raymond had never called him son before. Not once. In 12 years of marriage to his daughter. 12 years of holidays and birthdays and phone calls and the occasional visit. 12 years and he'd never used that word. It was a small word. 3 letters. But it contained an apology and a welcome and a promise, and 12 years of distance collapsing into a single syllable. The grandchildren came down the stairs in pajamas. Lily first, 6 years old, brown skin, her mother's eyes, her grandfather's jaw, though nobody had pointed that out to her because nobody talks to 6-year-olds about inherited bone structure. James behind her. 4. Still holding the railing with both hands because 4-year-olds treat stairs with the appropriate level of caution that adults have forgotten. They had been told that Grandpa was on a long trip and now he's home. That was all. Adrian had decided after consultation with a child psychologist that the truth could come later, in pieces, as they grew into the size of it, the way you give a child a lake, not all at once, one handful of water at a time. Lily walked up to him with the seriousness of a 6-year-old running customs. She looked at him. She evaluated him. She conducted the kind of assessment that only children are honest enough to perform. Adults pretend they aren't judging. Children don't bother with the pretense. "You were gone a long time." "I was." Why, Raymond knelt down. His knees clicked. The sound of a 62-year-old body. The sound of a man getting closer to the ground. "Because I was being a kind of grandfather you don't need, and I needed to stop." She thought about that. She thought about it the way 6-year-olds think about things with complete seriousness and no regard for the conventions that make adults dismiss ideas they don't like. "Are you going to be a different kind now I'm going to try?" She nodded once. A single nod. The kind of nod that Willa had given in a Holiday Inn 3 weeks earlier. The kind of nod that means I'll hold you to that without saying the words. Then she handed him a stuffed rabbit. Gray. One ear was longer than the other. The fur was matted in the way that fur gets when a child sleeps with something every night for years. "This is Mr. Pickles. You can sleep with him tonight because the guest room is scary." He took Mr. Pickles. He held the rabbit against his chest. He did not let go of Mr. Pickles for the next 9 days. He slept in the guest room. It was small, a queen bed with a quilt Adrian had bought at a craft fair, a nightstand with a lamp that didn't match anything, a window that looked out on the backyard where a swing set stood in the November darkness like a skeleton of something that had been alive in the summer. He lay in the bed with Mr. Pickles on the pillow next to him and listened to the house. Not the silence of a house, the sounds of it, the hum of the refrigerator, the click of the furnace, the creak of the floor in the hallway where Adrian walked past his door at midnight to check on the kids, the distant sound of Michael snoring, the house breathing. He'd lived in 6 houses over the course of his adult life. Every one of them had been large and expensive and professionally decorated and absolutely silent. The silence of houses built to impress, the silence of rooms designed to photograph well and live in poorly, the silence of spaces where footsteps echo and voices carry, and the distance between rooms is measured not in feet, but in degrees of loneliness. This house was small and full of sounds, and he slept better in it than he had slept in any house he'd ever owned. On the 4th morning, he made pancakes with Lily. This was the event he'd been thinking about since the motel room, since Adrian had said the words. Pancakes with Lily on a Saturday morning. He'd carried those words through 3 weeks of hiding, through a funeral he watched on a screen, through the arrest of his wife, through the collapse of his marriage and the reconstruction of his identity, and the slow, painful process of becoming a man he didn't recognize yet. Pancakes, the simplest possible thing. Flour and eggs and milk in a pan. He burned the first one. He burned it badly. The smoke alarm went off. James, who was eating cereal at the table, put his hands over his ears and said, "Grandpa, that's really loud," with the casual authority of a 4-year-old who has opinions about volume. Raymond waved a dish towel at the smoke alarm. The alarm stopped. He scraped the burned pancake into the trash. He started again. He burned the second one too. Not as badly. This one was merely black on one side rather than carbonized into something that could have been used as a roof tile. He burned the third one. This one was closer. Brown verging on dark brown. Edible if you were generous with the maple syrup and didn't look at it too closely. Lily watched all of this from her stool at the counter. She watched with the patient attention of a 6-year-old who has made pancakes with her mother many times and understands the process and is waiting for the adult to catch up. Grandpa. Yeah, you have to watch for the bubbles. The bubbles? When you pour the batter in the pan, little bubbles come up. You have to wait until the bubbles pop. Then you flip it. If you flip it before the bubbles pop, it's not ready. If you wait too long after the bubbles pop, it burns. She said this the way a surgeon explains a procedure, with calm, with certainty, with the understanding that the information she was providing was the difference between success and failure, and that the person she was providing it to was operating well below her level of expertise. Raymond poured the batter for the 4th pancake. He watched the pan. He watched the surface of the batter the way he'd watched markets and margins and quarterly reports for 40 years. With full attention, with everything he had. The bubbles appeared, small circles rising to the surface, breaking open, one by one, like tiny questions being asked and answered by the batter itself. He waited, he watched, he let the bubbles do their work. He flipped the pancake. It was perfect, golden, even. The kind of pancake you see in photographs. The kind that exists in the ideal version of a Saturday morning that most people carry in their heads, but rarely achieve. See, Grandpa, Lily said. You can learn. He cried in the kitchen while flipping a pancake. The tears came without warning, without sound. They just appeared on his face the way rain appears on a window. One moment dry, the next wet. He didn't let her see. Or maybe he did. Maybe she saw and decided to let him have it. The way 6-year-olds sometimes let the adults around them have the moments they need. The way children in their terrifying wisdom understand that grown-ups break sometimes, and the kindest thing you can do is pretend you didn't notice. She ate 3 pancakes. James ate 2. Michael ate 4. Adrian stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her father flip pancakes for her children, and she didn't say anything, and she didn't need to because her face was saying everything. Her face was saying, "This is what I asked for. This is all I ever asked for." Raymond ate 1 pancake. It tasted like the best thing he'd ever eaten. Better than the Michelin-starred restaurants in Zurich. Better than the private chef Vivian had hired for dinner parties. Better than anything that had ever been prepared for him by people who were paid to prepare things. It tasted like flour and eggs and milk and attention. It tasted like showing up. It tasted like the fourth try. He called Desmond on the seventh night. He sat in the guest room, on the bed, with Mr. Pickles in his lap. The house was quiet. Adrian and Michael were asleep. The children were asleep. The furnace clicked and hummed. The backyard swing set was a shadow against a sky full of stars that you could actually see in Denver. Stars that Greenwich had too much light pollution to show. He dialed the number. He hadn't called this number in 2 years. 2 years of silence between a father and a son. 2 years of a door that Raymond had closed by never opening it in the first place. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Raymond had decided in advance. If it went to voicemail, he would not leave a message. He would call back the next day, and the next, and the next, for as many days as it took. Because some doors you don't get to knock on once and walk away from. Some doors you stand in front of until your knuckles bleed or the door opens, whichever comes first. Desmond picked up on the fifth ring. Dad. That one word. Different from the way Adrian had said it. Adrian's dad had been an explosion. Relief and rage and love detonating simultaneously. Desmond's dad was quieter, flatter. The sound of a man who had trained himself not to hope for things from his father because hope was just disappointment wearing a disguise. Desmond. There was a long silence. Raymond could hear ambient sound on the other end. A coffee shop maybe, or a bar. Somewhere with low music and the murmur of other people's conversations. Desmond was 36 years old, and he was somewhere in Portland, surrounded by strangers, and his father, who he thought had died 3 weeks ago, was on the other end of the phone alive. I'm alive, Desmond. I'm in Denver. At Adrian's. Another silence. Longer this time. Raymond could hear his son breathing. The breathing of a man who was processing something that didn't fit into any category his mind had prepared for. I know, Desmond said finally. Adrian called me yesterday. She told me everything. Raymond closed his eyes. Of course she had. Of course Adrian had called her brother. Because that's what siblings do. They tell each other the truth when the parents won't. They build a private language of survival in the spaces their parents leave empty. He opened his eyes. He looked at Mr. Pickles. The rabbit's one good eye stared back at him with the unconditional acceptance that stuffed animals are so much better at than people. Desmond. I read your letter. Silence. I read the whole thing this time. I read it 3 times. The one you wrote when you were 19. The one I put in a drawer after 3 sentences and left there for 17 years. Raymond paused. He could hear his own voice in the small room. He could hear how it sounded. Not like a CEO, not like a billionaire, not like the man on the Forbes cover. Like a father, an old father. A father who was 17 years late and knew it. You were right about all of it. You were 19 and you were right. And I was 44 and I was wrong. And I let you carry that for 17 years. I let you walk around with the weight of a letter your father never finished reading. And every year that I didn't read it, I was telling you that your words didn't matter. That your heart didn't matter. That the thing you were trying to say to me wasn't worth my time. He stopped. He breathed. The furnace clicked. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm telling you I read it. I'm telling you I'm sorry. And I'm telling you that I'm going to be on a flight to Portland next Tuesday if you'll have coffee with me. And if you won't, I'll be on a flight the Tuesday after that. And the Tuesday after that. Until you tell me to stop. He could hear his son breathing on the other end. The breathing was different now. Uneven. The kind of breathing that happens when a person is trying not to cry and failing at it and not sure whether failing is a bad thing or the best thing that's happened to them all day. Dad? Yeah. Just come Tuesday. 4 words. Just come Tuesday. The most beautiful sentence Raymond Garrett had ever heard. More beautiful than any contract. More beautiful than any quarterly earnings report. More beautiful than the sentence that had made him rich, or the sentence that had made him famous, or any of the millions of sentences he'd read and written and spoken in 61 years of being alive. Just come Tuesday. He hung up the phone. He sat on the edge of the guest bed in his daughter's house in Denver. He held Mr. Pickles in his lap. The rabbit's matted fur was soft under his fingers. The one ear that was longer than the other flopped to the side. He understood that this was very possibly the first night of the rest of his actual life. Not the life on the magazine cover. Not the life in the boardroom, not the life that looked impressive from the outside and echoed with emptiness on the inside. His actual life, the one that was small and messy and full of burned pancakes and stuffed rabbits and phone calls that lasted 2 minutes and contained more truth than 40 years of business ever had. He went to Portland that Tuesday. He sat in a coffee shop on Hawthorne Boulevard with his son. They drank black coffee. Desmond's hands were ink-stained. The hands of a man who still wrote first drafts by hand because he believed the body needed to be involved in the making of a thing for the thing to be real. They talked for 3 hours, or rather Raymond listened for 3 hours. He listened to his son describe his life. The apartment above a bookstore, the teaching job at a community college, the collection of poems that had been published by a small press in Seattle and sold 1,100 copies, which Desmond said with a small self-deprecating smile was basically a bestseller in the poetry world. Raymond had never read the collection. He hadn't known it existed. His son had published a book and he hadn't known. He asked Desmond for a copy. Desmond reached into his bag and pulled one out. It was thin. The cover was blue. The title was a single word: Unseen. Raymond held it in his hands. He turned it over. On the back there was a photograph of Desmond, 34 years old in the picture, looking directly at the camera with the same quiet intensity that Raymond saw in the mirror every morning. The same jaw, the same eyes, the same face he'd been looking at his whole life without actually seeing it. He opened the book. He read the first poem. It was about a boy watching his father leave for work in the dark. 4:30 in the morning. The boy in the doorway, the father's back, the sound of a car starting, the headlights sweeping across the ceiling of the boy's bedroom, the silence that followed. Raymond read it twice. He looked up at his son. "This is about me." Desmond nodded. "They're all about you, Dad. The whole book. Every poem. I spent 6 years trying to write about something else, and everything kept coming back to the same doorway and the same car pulling out and the same kid standing there watching." Raymond closed the book. He held it in his lap the way he held Mr. Pickles, against his body, close to the center of himself. "I'm going to read every word." Desmond looked at him, searching for the performance, searching for the boardroom voice, the investor relations smile, the polished manufactured sincerity of a man who had spent his career making people believe things. He didn't find it, because it wasn't there. For the first time, the thing his father was saying and the thing his father was feeling were the same thing. No gap between them, no space for performance. "Okay, Dad." They sat in the coffee shop for another hour. They didn't talk about Vivian. They didn't talk about the plane. They didn't talk about the indictment or the trial or the news coverage or any of the enormous dramatic headline-making things that had happened. They talked about coffee. They talked about Portland rain. They talked about a poem Desmond was working on about a woodpecker. Raymond told him about the woodpecker at the cabin, and Desmond laughed. A real laugh. Not the guarded, careful laugh of a son who doesn't trust his father. The surprised laugh of a man who has just discovered that the person he wrote off years ago might still be capable of surprising him. When Raymond left, Desmond walked him to the door of the coffee shop. They stood on the sidewalk. It was raining. Portland rain. The kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air like a suggestion. "Dad?" "Yeah." Next Tuesday too. 6 months later, on a Saturday in May, Raymond was sitting on a bench at a park in upstate New York. The grass was green in the way that May grass is green, the violent, almost aggressive green of a world that has been waiting all winter to prove it's still alive. There was a softball game happening on the field in front of him. 10-year-old girls. Yellow jerseys against blue jerseys. The yellow team was winning by 4 runs. Their coach was a large man in a too-tight polo shirt who clapped after every play, regardless of outcome, the kind of coach who believed encouragement was a strategy and wasn't entirely wrong. The blue team was losing. Their coach was a woman with a ponytail and a clipboard who kept checking the lineup and making adjustments that weren't going to change the score, but might change how the girls felt about the score, which was a different kind of victory. Number 11 on the blue team was up to bat. She was small for her age, 10 years old now, birthday in March. She wore her cap pulled low the way her mother wore her hair pulled back. Functional, no nonsense. The style of women who have work to do and don't want anything getting in the way. She had a notebook in her back pocket. She carried it everywhere, even at bat, even in the field. Even her mother had told Raymond once with a mixture of pride and exasperation in her sleep. She'd fallen asleep with it so many times that the cover had taken on the shape of her body. The unicorn was faded now. The horn had peeled off completely, but the pages inside were full. Every one of them. 6 months of new observations, new drawings, new notes in the margins. She didn't write about pilots anymore. She wrote about everything. Trees, cloud patterns, the way her teacher's voice changed when she was tired, the number of steps between her front door and the bus stop, the exact shade of brown that a leaf turns before it falls. Willa Beckett was becoming by any reasonable measure one of the most observant human beings Raymond had ever encountered. And Raymond had spent 40 years surrounded by analysts and consultants and intelligence professionals whose entire job was to notice things. None of them noticed the way Willa noticed, because their attention was transactional. They noticed things because they were paid to. Willa noticed things because she couldn't stop, because the world was endlessly interesting to her, because every detail was a small gift waiting to be opened, and she had the patience to open every single one. Willa swung at the first pitch. Missed. The bat cut through the air with a sound like a door closing. She swung at the second pitch, fouled it off. The ball skipped along the dirt toward the third baseline and rolled to a stop against the fence. She swung at the third pitch. Missed. Strike three. She was out. She walked back to the dugout. She didn't cry. She didn't sulk. She didn't throw the bat or kick the dirt or do any of the things that 10-year-olds do when the world doesn't cooperate with their plans. She sat down on the bench. She pulled out the notebook. She wrote something in it. 20 seconds of careful writing. Then she put the notebook back in her pocket. Then she looked up. She saw Raymond. He was sitting 30 yards away, on a wooden bench near the parking lot, wearing the kind of clothes he wore now. Khakis, a blue jacket, the baseball cap. No Brioni, no Patek Philippe. He'd given the watch to Frank. He'd told Frank to sell it and give the money to the family of Peter Hale. Frank had looked at him for a long time and then put the watch in his pocket and said nothing, because some gestures don't need commentary. Willa saw him. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't call out to him or get up from the bench or do anything that would draw attention to the fact that the man sitting near the parking lot was the man she had pulled off a plane 7 months ago. She just nodded once. A single nod. Small. Barely a movement. The kind of nod that passes between two people who share a history that doesn't need to be performed. He nodded back. That was their entire exchange. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a conversation conducted in the smallest possible gesture. A conversation that said, I see you and I know you're here, and we don't need to make a thing of it. After the game, he walked over to Lorraine. She was sitting 2 benches down from where he'd been. She had stopped working at the airport 4 months ago. She was taking nursing classes at the community college in the next town. Willa was in a school district that had a chess club and a robotics team and a library with 2 librarians who both knew her name because she was there every day after school, sitting in the corner with her notebook, reading and writing and watching the world do what the world does. There was a trust. There were arrangements. College for Willa, a home for Lorraine, healthcare, the architecture of security, all of it in place. All of it settled. There were no strings on any of it, because Raymond had decided somewhere in a cabin in the Adirondacks that the moment you put strings on a gift, you've turned it back into a transaction. And he had transacted enough for one lifetime. Lorraine handed him a paper cup of bad coffee from the snack stand, the kind of coffee that comes from a machine that hasn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration and tastes like hot water that once sat in the same room as a coffee bean. She missed her swing, Lorraine said. She'll get the next one. She doesn't get upset. No, she doesn't. They sat there for a moment. 2 people on a bench at a softball game. One of them used to clean bathrooms. The other used to be on the cover of Forbes. Neither of those facts mattered here. Here they were just 2 people watching a 10-year-old girl play a game she wasn't particularly good at, with a focus and determination that had nothing to do with winning. Lorraine looked at him. Raymond, can I ask you something? Anything. Why do you come to every game? He thought about it. He thought about it for a long time. He watched Willa across the field. She was sitting on the dugout bench, untying and retying her cleats. The laces were getting frayed. She tied them carefully, methodically, the way she did everything. He watched a little girl who had saved his life with one whispered sentence on a tarmac in November. A girl who had become the closest thing he had to a teacher in 62 years on Earth. A girl who had taught him without knowing she was teaching him that the most powerful thing a person can do is pay attention. Not the kind of attention that analyzes and strategizes and monetizes. The kind that simply watches. The kind that writes down, smiled, waved, didn't wave, had a different watch, walked funny today. The kind that notices when something changes and trusts the noticing even when no one else does. He turned to Lorraine. Because she taught me what attention looks like, he said. And I'm 62 years old, and I'm just learning. And the only way to learn it is to practice. Lorraine looked at him for a long moment. The look of a woman who has spent her life being unseen by men like him and is now being seen in a way she didn't know was possible. The look of a mother who understands that her daughter changed a man's life and that the man is trying in his clumsy, late, imperfect way to be worthy of the change. She nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They sat on the bench, two people who weren't strangers anymore. The blue team lost by 4 runs. Nobody minded. The girls lined up and shook hands, and the coaches said good game, and the parents folded their chairs, and the sun went down behind the bleachers. The light was the color of old brass, the same color it had been on a November afternoon 7 months ago when Raymond Garrett had walked out of a terminal holding a 9-year-old girl's hand and didn't know yet that he was walking into the rest of his life. He finished his bad coffee. He set the empty cup on the bench beside him. He watched the field empty out. The bases were pulled up. The chalk lines faded into the grass. The scoreboard, a manual one with numbers hung on hooks, was taken down by a dad in a windbreaker who whistled while he worked. Willa came out of his dugout. She had her bag over one shoulder and her notebook in her hand. She walked toward her mother. She walked past Raymond, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her shoulder. She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. She'd already said everything she needed to say with that single nod from the dugout. But as she passed, she said one thing, quietly, without turning her head. The way a person says something that's meant only for the air between two people and no one else. Same time next week, Mr. Garrett. Same time next week, Willa. She kept walking. She reached her mother. She took Lorraine's hand. They walked toward the parking lot together. Willa's bag bouncing against her hip, the notebook in her other hand, the faded unicorn cover catching the last of the light. Raymond sat on the bench and watched them go. He sat there for a long time after everyone else had left. The field was empty. The parking lot was almost empty. The sky was darkening from brass to purple to the deep, quiet blue that comes just before the stars. He thought about his father, the welder from Baltimore, the man who said the only thing a man really owns is what he pays attention to. He thought about his daughter in Denver who was teaching him how to be a father by letting him burn pancakes in her kitchen. He thought about his son in Portland who had written an entire book about watching his father's car pull out of the driveway in the dark. He thought about Frank who had warned him and waited and come when he called. He thought about Lily who had trusted him with Mr. Pickles. He thought about James who had opinions about volume. He thought about 7 names on a list in a cabin. And he thought about Willa, who was 10 years old now, who carried a notebook everywhere, who had saved his life because she paid attention to things that everyone else had learned to ignore, who had taught a 62-year-old man that the most valuable thing in the world isn't money or power or influence or any of the things he'd spent his life accumulating. It's noticing. It's watching for the bubbles. It's knowing when to flip and when to wait. It's standing at a window and waving at a cleaning woman because it costs nothing to make someone feel seen. Raymond stood up from the bench. His knees clicked, the sound of a body that had earned every year it carried. He brushed off his khakis. He picked up the empty coffee cup and carried it to the trash can near the parking lot, because Lorraine's daughter had taught him that small things matter, and leaving a cup on a bench is the kind of small thing that says you think someone else will clean up after you. He walked to his car, not the car with the butterscotch leather that Vivian had chosen. A rental, a mid-sized sedan that smelled like air freshener and other people's trips. He got in. He sat behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine. He pulled out his phone. He had a text from Adrienne, a photograph. Lily in the kitchen, standing on her stool holding a spatula, flour on her nose, grinning. The caption said she made them herself this morning. 4 out of 4. No burns. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put the phone away. He started the car. He pulled out of the parking lot. He drove past the field where the chalk lines were already disappearing into the grass. He drove past the bleachers where the brass light had been. He drove past the sign for the park and onto the road that led back to the small apartment he was renting now in a town he'd never heard of a year ago. Not 6 houses, 1 apartment, 2 rooms, a kitchen where he was learning to cook things that weren't pancakes, a living room with a bookshelf that held 1,100 copies worth of his son's poetry, and a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Pickles that Lily had officially given him on his last visit because she said she was too old for stuffed animals now, which they both knew wasn't true, but which gave her a reason to give her grandfather something permanent. He drove with the windows cracked. May air, the smell of cut grass and warm dirt, and the particular sweetness that evening has in the Northeast when winter is finally done, apologizing for itself. He drove home, to a life that was small and ordinary in his.